Can a courtroom turn into a battleground? You won't believe what happens next.
Officer Brent Maddox is on trial for misconduct, but he isn't worried about the charges. He's angry about who's presiding, a black woman, Judge Vanessa Rhodess. From the moment he walks into the courtroom, his resentment simmers. He doesn't believe someone like her should be judging a man like him.
As the trial unfolds, his anger builds until one day, in front of a packed courtroom, Maddox snaps.
What happens next shocks the entire city and exposes a system that's protected him for far too long.
Will justice prevail, or will chaos reign? Stay tuned to find out. But when the mask slips, the truth is far worse.
And Judge Rhodess, she's not backing down.
Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from. And make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss.
The marble pillars of the Charleston Federal Courthouse stood tall beneath the thick morning clouds. The sun struggling to break through as if it too was reluctant to witness what the day would bring. Inside, tension moved like humidity, slow, suffocating, and impossible to ignore.
Courtroom 2B hadn't seen a crowd like this in years. Staffers who had no business there found excuses to stay. Reporters filled every designated row, their phones silenced but ready.
Bailiffs stood just a bit more alert than usual, eyes flicking toward the defendant's table whenever the man seated there made the slightest move. Judge Vanessa Rhodess walked the East Corridor with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through nearly 2 decades on the bench. Her robe was folded neatly over her arm, her heels clicking in a rhythm that said she'd measured every step. Not because she needed to, but because people like Brent Maddox expected her to stumble. She passed 2 clerks whispering near the stairwell. They fell silent the moment they saw her.
She didn't acknowledge them, not out of rudeness, out of practice.
Inside the courtroom, Maddox sat with his arms folded across his chest, legs spread wide like the defendant's table was just another patrol car seat, and he had every right to be there.
His suit didn't fit properly. Too tight in the shoulders, sleeves just a little short.
His lawyer leaned over and murmured something in his ear. "You need to keep your mouth shut today," the lawyer said, not quite loud enough for the microphones to catch.
"No grandstanding, no comments. Just let me handle it." Maddox smirked. Didn't look at him. "Funny. You act like I'm the one on trial here," he muttered.
"You are on trial," the lawyer snapped quietly.
"This is serious. One more outburst and you could tank any chance of avoiding jail time." Maddox rolled his eyes. "If she was a real judge, we wouldn't even be having this circus. She's got a damn agenda, Brent."
"I said what I said," the lawyer leaned back in his chair, clearly realizing words were wasted. One of the bailiffs across the room shifted slightly, hand near his holster, watching Maddox's posture as if reading the curve of his spine for the moment he'd spring. Even without saying much, Maddox carried the kind of energy that made trained men hold their breath. The door behind the bench opened, and the room drew still. Judge Rhodess stepped in, the black robe now flowing over her frame with deliberate weight.
She didn't look at Maddox. She didn't need to.
She scanned the gallery, acknowledged the court reporter with a subtle nod, then sat with a stillness that made the wood creak beneath her feel almost disrespectful.
"Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Rhodess picked up the gavel and brought it down once. The sound echoed like a warning through the room.
"Good morning," she said.
"We'll continue with the testimony from yesterday. Is the witness ready?"
"Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor responded, standing as a woman approached the stand. The forensic analyst took her oath, adjusted the microphone, and began recounting the evidence. Data inconsistencies, radio logs that didn't match Maddox's report, timing discrepancies that painted a different picture than what he'd submitted under oath.
She spoke carefully, measured, but the implications were devastating.
Maddox's version of the story had holes, and they were starting to widen. He shifted in his chair, muttering under his breath, but loud enough for the front row to hear.
"Lies," he hissed. "All of it."
The judge's eyes flicked down toward him. "Mr. Maddox," she said calmly.
"You'll remain silent during testimony."
He leaned forward slightly, voice low and bitter.
"With all due respect, Your Honor, how am I supposed to sit here and let this happen?
You're here to listen, she said without pause. Her voice neither sharp nor soft.
Just certain.
Your counsel will have a chance to cross-examine shortly.
Maddox smirked. Sure. Like that'll matter.
One of the bailiffs took a step forward.
Rhodess raised a hand, not to silence Maddox, but to halt the officer. She didn't need backup. Not yet.
The prosecutor continued, asking about the recovered dashcam footage and inconsistencies between the audio logs and the bodycam submission.
The analyst explained how sections were missing, likely edited.
Maddox stared at her, jaw clenched. She's guessing, he said louder.
She wasn't there.
The judge leaned in just slightly, still seated.
Mr. Maddox, I won't tell you again.
You will not interrupt this proceeding.
If you cannot control yourself, I will have you removed.
That shut him up, but only on the surface. His eyes locked on Rhodess now, not in deference, but in challenge.
There was something unsettled about his stillness, something that hadn't been there yesterday.
His fingers tapped against his thigh. His foot bounced once and stopped. His breathing had changed.
Judge Rhodess saw it.
She didn't show that she saw it, but she did.
And what she felt in that moment wasn't fear. It was preparation.
She had seen this kind of quiet before, not the kind that settled a room, the kind that waited for a spark.
The witness stepped down. Rhodess glanced at the clock.
We'll take a 10-minute recess, she said.
Cross-examination will resume afterward. The gavel struck once more.
As the courtroom emptied in low murmurs, Rhodess remained behind the bench for a moment, her eyes lingering on the man at the defense table. Maddox was smiling now, but not like someone amused, like someone who thought he'd already won something. She rose and walked back to her chambers, her expression unchanged. But beneath the surface, her mind was already working through every variable, not just because Maddox was dangerous, but because men like him always believed that fear would bend the rules in their favor.
And if he was planning to make his move, he hadn't yet realized who he was facing.
The courtroom filled slowly after the recess was called. But the weight inside the room had changed. Where there had once been idle curiosity, reporters scribbling notes half-heartedly, bailiffs half-watching the gallery, there was now the quiet pull of unease, like the air itself was waiting. The kind of tension that didn't come from anything obvious, but rather from something under the surface, something that hadn't happened yet, but felt dangerously close. Maddox was already seated, unmoved since the last gavel. His hands rested on the table, but his fingers twitched every few seconds like they were searching for something to hold. His lawyer returned last, tightening his tie and glancing at his client like a man who had already lost the argument 3 times before lunch. You're going to answer nothing more than what's asked, he said in a low voice as he leaned in.
Let me do the work. Maddox didn't even look at him.
She thinks she's clever. She's a federal judge, the lawyer said. And if you don't keep your mouth shut, she's going to bury you without lifting a finger.
Maddox snorted. We'll see.
When Judge Rhodess returned, she moved with the same steady pace she always did, her robe brushing behind her as she walked. She took her seat, nodded once, and looked out over the room like she was measuring the temperature before speaking. You may proceed with your cross-examination, she said, eyes landing briefly on the defense table. The lawyer stood. His questions were sharp, measured, and clearly rehearsed. He tried to undercut the forensic analyst's earlier claims, pushing back on timelines, questioning the data interpretations, hinting at procedural gaps. But none of it landed with the weight he hoped for. The analyst remained composed, her answers unwavering, and every attempt to discredit her only seemed to highlight the steadiness of her testimony.
Maddox didn't like it.
He began shifting in his seat, mumbling things under his breath that no one could quite make out, but the tone was unmistakable.
Resentful, angry, personal.
When the analyst referenced the body cam edits again, Maddox let out a dry laugh that echoed in the quiet room.
Rhodess looked down from the bench. Mr. Maddox, I'll remind you once again that you are not to interrupt.
He turned slightly, loud enough now for everyone to hear.
I'm not interrupting. I'm reacting. There's a difference. The judge didn't blink. One more remark and you'll be removed from the room. That is your final warning.
He leaned, resemble neutrality, but the muscles in his jaw twitched just enough to betray it.
Rhodess continued, "You didn't lose control of the public," she said.
"You lost their belief that you were ever in control for the right reasons." Then she opened a folder and laid it on the podium. Printed statements, leaked memos, and formal grievances that had been ignored.
She read a paragraph aloud.
It was from an officer who had tried to file a complaint about Maddox 6 years ago. His file had been quietly reassigned. His request was buried. The complaint was marked resolved and he was warned not to press it further. "You marked his truth result because it was easier than confronting your own," she said, turning slightly to face the rows of officials seated behind her.
"That stops now."
The applause was not loud, but it was long, and when it faded, the committee chair asked a question that everyone had been circling.
"Judge Rhodess, if the recommendations you've submitted are approved, what comes next?"
Rhodess looked out over the crowd, not at the cameras, not at the officials, but at the people seated in folding chairs and standing along the walls.
Teachers, nurses, transit workers, teenagers holding their parents' hands, retired veterans, students in city college sweatshirts, the people who had kept showing up when the institution said it was too late, she answered simply.
"We rebuild," she said, with the truth at the foundation this time.
That evening, the news didn't break.
It surged. Not just in Charleston, not just in the state. National anchors read her words on air.
Editorials began appearing within hours. Calls for inquiry reached departments in other cities.
And still, Rhodess stayed off camera.
She didn't accept interviews.
She didn't host conferences. She walked into her office early the next morning, same as she had the morning before Maddox's trial began.
The robe on the hanger, the same desk, the same window.
But the city outside had changed. It was louder now, not in sound, but in awareness. Later that day, the committee voted to approve every one of her recommendation.
37 officers and officials were placed under formal review.
Internal Affairs was dissolved and scheduled to be rebuilt under an independent civilian board.
And Leonard Price, once considered the untouchable gatekeeper of city justice, resigned quietly before sunset.
The foundations had cracked, but they hadn't collapsed.
Not yet.
Rhodess stood at the edge of the courthouse steps that evening, watching the people gather again, their signs lifted higher now, not out of rage, but out of insistence, not asking anymore, demanding.
And this time, no one was turning away. The courtroom looked different now. Not in layout. The same benches lined the gallery.
The same polished rail divided observers from the trial floor, and the same creak of old wood followed every step made across its surface. But something deeper had changed. Something in the air, in the posture of those who sat watching, in the weight that once rested on silence, now replaced by a stillness that felt earned, not forced. Brent Maddox stood at the defense table in a plain suit, hands clasped in front of him. No badge, no supporters seated behind him, no remaining illusion of power. His face, thinner now, had none of the smugness it once carried, only the stillness of someone who had run out of room, and could no longer pretend he hadn't.
Judge Rhodess did not preside.
She sat in the gallery, a quiet presence in a row filled with community leaders, former complainants, and journalists who had followed the story from the moment it left the courtroom in handcuffs and spread across a city that no longer agreed to look away. The case had been swift. The evidence had never been lacking. The footage, the weapon, the eyewitnesses, the intent. What had taken time was no longer proving guilt.
It was finally acknowledging it.
The prosecutor delivered closing arguments that required no embellishment.
Maddox had pulled a firearm inside a federal courtroom.
He had aimed it at a sitting judge. He had discharged it in front of over 30 witnesses.
That alone would have secured a conviction.
But the weight of what came after, the hearings, the investigations, the victims stepping forward with stories long buried, that added a context the jury could not ignore. When the foreperson stood and read the verdict, there was no gasp, no shouts, no outbursts, only a quiet exhale.
Guilty on all counts.
Attempted murder of a federal judge. Brandishing a weapon in a secured government building, assault with a deadly weapon, terroristic threats, resisting lawful arrest, federal obstruction, he would not be eligible for parole. The sentencing hearing would follow in 60 days, but everyone in that room already knew he would not walk free again. Rhodess did not shift in her seat. She did not smile. She did not close her eyes or bow her head. She simply watched, just as she had watched him the day he first pulled the gun. Unmoved by the noise and unmoved by the silence, her focus resting on the truth of the moment and the work still ahead. After the verdict, no one rushed to the courthouse steps. There were no camera flashes bursting through the double doors. Instead, there was a different kind of response.
Calm, grounded, organized.
Outside, a group from a local advocacy organization passed out printed lists of new city reform policies. At the front of the building, a crowd of school teachers who had marched weeks earlier stood in line to sign a petition for expanded community review boards. And along the sidewalk, where protesters once held signs demanding justice, now stood volunteers from a new task force, gathering names of residents interested in participating in public safety roundtables. The shift was real. It was still forming, still fragile, but it was real. Inside her office later that day, Rhodess sat behind her desk, reading over the draft charter for the Civilian Review Board.
Carla had left it there earlier with a note. This is what we said we'd reach. We're almost there. Tiffany's latest article had gone live that morning. It didn't lead with Maddox's name. It led with someone else's. The judge who didn't flinch. How Vanessa Rhodess helped turn a city toward accountability. The piece was long, deliberate, like her courtroom. It told the full story, not just of the incident, but of the years before it. The silence, the failures, and the steady hand that refused to let fear speak louder than responsibility. Rhodess had refused all interview requests, but Tiffany's article didn't need direct quotes. It told the story through impact. Later that evening, Rhodess received a call from Washington. The voice on the other end belonged to a U.S. Senator who served on the National Judicial Reform Committee. We've been following what's happened in Charleston.
The hearings, the votes, the outcome.
Rhodess listened but said nothing. We're putting together a task force, federal level. Judges, civil rights attorneys, former prosecutors, we'd like your insight, your leadership, if you're willing. She didn't answer immediately. She turned and looked out the tall window of her office, the city beneath her glowing orange from the last light of day. Below, traffic hummed, voices carried, and the hum of ordinary life continued, but different now, not untouched, just more aware. Finally, she said, send me the details. The call ended soon after.
She stayed at the window for a long time, not thinking of herself, not thinking of Maddox. She thought about the people who had come forward, the names on the signs, the faces that kept showing up even when the weather turned cold, and the cameras moved on. The silence that had once been the city's greatest defense, now replaced by a new, louder kind of stillness, one that did not come from fear, but from watching, listening, remembering.
Maddox had fallen.
But more importantly, the shield that had once protected men like him had cracked wide open, and now the rebuilding could begin. The courthouse lobby was still, not empty.
Staff moved with their usual purpose.
Security stood at their posts, and visitors checked in with folded papers and quiet questions, but still in a way that felt grounded. The building no longer buzzed with nerves or suspicion. The tension that had once settled into its corners like dust had been cleared out by weeks of testimony, by headlines that refused to soften, by citizens who no longer asked permission to be heard.
A mural now lined the north-facing wall near the main entrance.
It hadn't been commissioned through the city or painted by any professional artist. It had started with chalk. One name scrolled beneath the seal in block letters left behind by a teenager who had stood on the courthouse steps every Saturday with her mother. The chalk had faded, but others came after.
Someone brought markers, then paint. Eventually, one of the custodians asked the judge if they should remove it. She had told them, no, not yet. Now the wall held dozens of names. Not just those who had been hurt, but those who had stood, those who had spoken when it would have been easier to walk away, officers who testified against their own. Witnesses who came forward without legal protection, clerks who flagged documents that had been buried, citizens who showed up even when they weren't sure it would matter. That morning, Rhodess passed the wall on her way in. She didn't stop, not because it didn't matter, but because it was no longer about her. The names didn't orbit around the badge or the bench. They stood on